About Matthew chapter 7, even Matthew chapter 8. Well, thank you. You guys are opening up your Bibles in Matthew chapter 8. We're going to go over this morning the authority of the king. We're going to see three miracles that Jesus did in Matthew chapter 8 that show his authority. And these miracles are something spectacular. I want to tell you a story about two friends that went out hunting. And one was bragging about how good of a shot he was. And about that time, a duck flew over and he took aim and he fired. And the duck flew on unscathed. And he paused a minute and he said, "Wow, my friend, you're now witnessing a miracle. There flies a dead duck." That's right, some of you guys got that. Oftentimes people claim to be miracle workers today, but their miracles fail in comparison to what Jesus did. Little Zoe tried to work a miracle in healing Brandon's face, but it didn't work, as we see. But just kidding, Brandon, we love you. We're going to see some legitimate miracles by Jesus this morning and show how he has authority to be the king. Often we've talked about in the Gospel of Matthew how Matthew arranged his gospel topically, and that's important on how to understand what he brings up. And what I was doing this entire week is I was literally just meditating mostly on why did Matthew put these three miracle stories right here in Matthew chapter 8, and why did he put them in this order? And I'm going to try to share with you some of my thoughts and my conclusions this morning. But one thing I want to point out is this. Jesus has just come off the mountaintop. Look at chapter 8, verse 1. It says, "When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him." Now, you remember the setting here, right? Matthew 5 through 7, we have the Sermon on the Mount. And I talked about before how Matthew sets up his gospel showing how Jesus is this fulfillment of the prophet that Moses talked about. He's one who, he's born in such a way and he goes down into Egypt and he comes up out of Egypt like the Israelites did. And he came out and he was baptized in the Jordan. And then he goes off into the wilderness and he comes out of the wilderness just like the Israelites did. And he goes up on the mountain to give the law of God, to give the Sermon on the Mount. And here he is coming off the Sermon on the Mount. He's coming off of that big high mountaintop experience to come back down into the trenches to teach us about his authority. It says when large crowds followed him, it says a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean." Now, we're at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. If you look at his life, the Gospel of John lists out for us 4 Passovers that Jesus went through. The fourth one obviously being the one that he was crucified at. But here, Jesus has gone through his first Passover. He's met the Samaritan woman at the well. He's gone back up into Galilee and started one of his teaching ministries. He cast out a few demons in Capernaum. And now we get to this story. So we're early on into Jesus' ministry. He hasn't started all that controversy that he starts, as we know, in the Gospels. Right? All those times the scribes and the Pharisees are wanting to kill him. All that stuff is to come. This is at the very beginning, where he comes out and he starts to do miracles in Galilee, and people hear about him. And now he's coming off the mountain. He's got large crowds, and a leper comes up to him. Now, I got these three people. We have the leper, the centurion, and Peter's mother-in-law. And I want to think about these three different instances on how it shows Jesus' authority. So this first person, the leper, I characterize as healing an outcast with bad theology. Healing an outcast person with bad theology. What is the condition of this leper? Sometimes we have that term and we don't really even know what it means. What does it mean that this person was a leper? Well, if you look in the Gospel of Luke, he tells us this person is covered with leprosy. We read in the Old Testament about leprosy a little bit, and it can start off as a boil and kind of gets as an infection, and it spreads, and it gets to a point where it's infecting your whole body. This is not a person who has a scab on his arm or has a little bit, off on the side of his chest. This is a person who is entirely covered from head to toe in leprosy. There is no question whether he has a disease or not. Because in the Old Testament, people, when they started to get these infections, there was ways that the law of Moses said, let the priest figure out by doing these things, whether it's leprosy or just some other issue. There's no question with this guy. He has it. He doesn't question it. Nobody else questions it. And I want to read you this quote by a scholar that talks about the lifestyle of a leper. He says this, "Wrapped in the mourner's garb, the leper passed by His cry, "Unclean," was to incite others to pray for him, but also to avoid him. No one was to even salute him. His bed was to be low, inclining towards the ground. Even if he put his head into a place, that place would become unclean. No less than a distance of 6 feet must be kept from a leper. Imagine that. You start walking up to somebody and they say, "Hey, step back 6 feet. You're a leper." He says, and if the wind came from that direction, 100 feet is what you wanted. And one rabbi would not eat an egg purchased in a street where a leper had walked. Another rabbi boasted he always threw stones at them to keep them afar off, while others hid themselves or ran away. This was the life of a leper. This is how people in the Old Testament viewed lepers. Moses, as I said, gave us ways to deal with leprosy and 8 other infections that could be mistaken for leprosy. These people were to live outside the camp while they were wandering in the wilderness. They wouldn't even let them inside the camp with the tribes. They had to be outside the camp. And once they came into the land of Canaan and they established their cities, the people were quarantined off. That means they couldn't participate in worship at the temple. They couldn't be living with their family. In fact, they couldn't even be touched, because if they were touched, then the person would become unclean and wouldn't be able to worship themselves. So they probably forgot what it was even like to feel the embrace of another. And I think about how we may treat certain people today. Now, I was dealing with a guy the other day who had bed bugs. And if anybody knows things about that, that's kind of one of those where everybody's now starting to itch, right? You all are starting to you didn't itch, but you're starting to think about itching. Because bed bugs, we are like, oh, that's disgusting. And we had to take this guy and transport him up to the hospital for certain reasons I'm not going to get into. But I had to put him in the back of my vehicle. Now, what do you think I did after I dropped him off? I was like, how can I bomb my vehicle? I went by the fire station and I asked them what they use to clean stuff. And they were like, well, we can catch it on fire and use it as a training experience. And I was like, sounds good to me, as long as it's an accident. No, but I ended up getting these I was wiping down my car, and I was a little freaked out for a few days. And when I take this guy to the hospital, I had gloves on, of course. I take him to the hospital, and the people at the hospital were putting on these biohazard suits. And I'm just normally dressed, and I was thinking to myself, so should I have one of those suits? That's what I asked them, and they were like, well, yeah, probably. And I was like, so? And they're like, well, you may have gotten bed bugs. And I was like, oh, this is going to be really bad. My wife is going to kill me. So, I was freaking out for a few days, and we didn't get bed bugs, which was great. That was fantastic. And then, here's another fun story. So then, just a couple weeks after that, as soon as my brain is releasing the bed bug syndrome, we were dealing with another lady with other issues, and they said, hey, Dyer, set her in the back of your car for a minute while we interview this person. I said, okay, cool. Set her in the back of my car, and then after about 15 minutes in my car, she says, oh, yeah, by the way, I have scabies. Which I text my wife and said, what's scabies? And she begins to immediately freak out and send me emojis of freaking out and telling me I'm not allowed to come home for a week. And tells me she will kill me if we have scabies. And I was like, well, evidently this is bad. And I came to find out they're these little microorganisms that crawl in your skin and plant eggs. So again, how do you think we were feeling? We were like, stand back, 100 yards. We don't want to touch you. That's how we feel with people, who have certain physical diseases that we may think, I don't want to catch that. Right? My question is, how do we treat people who are just covered in sin? It reminds me of a story of a priest in Russia in the mid to late 19th century. And this was a time in Russia where they had dirty marketplaces. The place was rotting beneath its own weight. The streets were dangerous. There was poverty and depravity all over the place. Crime was running rampant. Alcoholism was all over the place. Prostitutes and thieves were all over the streets. There was no safe place to live, so most of the people who weren't part of that world didn't venture into it. And the clergy there in Russia used their life of privilege and status. They used this in order to insulate themselves from this peril and hardship. But not so for one man named John, a priest. His daily practice was to don his robe and descend into the meanest parts of the city. He walked among the addicts and the predators, the whores and the thieves, the orphans and the widows. He did it with healing in his wings. He would find the most broken man or woman he could track down, lying in a gutter or standing on a street corner. He would cup their chin in his big hand, lift their face, and say, "This," referring to this sort of life, this means of survival, this condition that they're in. He would say, "This is beneath your dignity. You were created to house the glory of the living God." You think about that for a second. And when we kind of sit back and like, wow, that's powerful. Why is it powerful? It's powerful because we see a man who can look at another human being in their worst state and see that they were still made in the image of God. They're still made in the image of God. And that's one thing that we have to always keep in mind, right? That no matter who we meet, who may walk through these doors, who may come into our lives, completely covered, head to toe in disgusting sin, the Lord Jesus, the King of glory, has the authority and the power to heal them of all of their sickness. And see, we need to make sure that we don't create a church in such a way that people feel like we have hands at the front door saying, "Hold on, you have to stand 6 feet back." We need to make sure rather that we have arms wide open saying, "Come feel the embrace of the King." Because look at this. I love this. It says, verse 2, "A leper came to him, bowed down before him, and said to him, 'Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean.'" He was kind of breaking the cultural norm in the fact that he came to Jesus because he was supposed to stand off and yell unclean. Instead, he comes and it says he bows down to Jesus. And I want you to picture this. I want you to picture large crowds following Jesus. He's gaining popularity. Do you think this is something that's going to make him popular? Having an outcast come up to him and bow down? Everybody's looking around going, Jesus is about to step back. Jesus is about to kick some dust on this guy and run the other way. Instead, look at this. This is one of my favorite stories about Jesus. Verse 3. Jesus stretched out his hand, and what did he do? Touched him. That's not just a word for touch, people. That's the word for cling to. Jesus didn't reach out and go, "Hey, be clean." Jesus embraced this man who was filled with leprosy to the shock and awe of everybody around him. And didn't say, "I will make you clean." He said, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately the leprosy left him. You think about the faith of this leper. He's heard about Jesus. He realizes Jesus is his only hope. And even though he has bad theology, you see, he knows about the power of Jesus, but he doesn't trust in his goodness. "If you're willing, Jesus, to make me clean." Why would he doubt at all that Jesus would be willing to make him clean? Why at all would sinners in the world doubt whether God is willing to forgive them or not? Have you ever met somebody like that? I have. "I'm too bad to go to church." Have you ever heard that one? You ever thought that one? Yeah, absolutely. And I start rattling off to people all the saints in the Bible. You talk about Moses who killed people, right? Remember he killed the Egyptian? You talk about Saul who used to murder Christians. You talk about James and John who asked for God to commit, genocide and burn down the whole Samaritan people because he wouldn't let them stay with them in their Motel 6. Those people, those stained glass saints, right? And people think that they're too bad to be touched by Jesus. Why? Maybe it's because we haven't introduced him the right way. And we see the compassion of the King. We see the authority of the King. Not just "I will," but "I desire to." And so we shouldn't ask God if he's willing to touch us. God should ask us if we're willing to bow down before him. That's the only question on whether we're going to be cleansed or not. But let's move on to the next one. It says this in verse 5. "And Jesus entered Capernaum. A centurion came to him, imploring him, and saying, 'Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented.' And Jesus said, 'I will come and heal him.'" Here's a man I call the unprecedented healing because of a faithful friend. The unprecedented healing because of a faithful friend. Here you have a servant who is so bad, he can't come to Jesus on his own. And we see this a few times in the Gospels. But what I think is interesting is Matthew says he is fearfully tormented. Now, this word tormented is used in Revelation 20:10 to talk about the lake of fire. Does that sound like a good thing to you? No. So here's a man who has some sort of condition that has knocked him bedridden so bad that he's not just laying in his bed, but he is in anguish and pain. He's like, give me the morphine, hitting the button, come bring it on. Let's go. He is lying tormented, paralyzed by whatever he has. And what's also interesting is that the centurion, my version says servant, because he was a servant. We know that from Luke. But Matthew says the centurion calls him his son. Now, you could call a servant your son. If he was like you and you loved him and you guys had a great relationship, that could happen. But it shows that this centurion loved this man. They had such a bond, such a relationship, that this centurion is, first of all, when we read Luke, we see that the centurion sent a group of elders from the Jews to go meet Jesus and ask Jesus, hey, will you come and heal my servant? And then he sends a group of friends and says, well, hold on a second. I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. And then he comes himself and meets Jesus. Matthew just gives us kind of the truncated version. It says the centurion came, but I kind of want to picture out this whole concept of what's going on and just the emotional stress that's going on with the centurion, a man of great power. I mean, the Romans were benevolent administrators and good builders. And, they used their taxes to improve the provinces. And we see in the Gospel of Luke, this same story, that the Jews who were sent by this centurion said, this man who's a Gentile, think about this, we're Jews, he's a Gentile, he's a good man, he's been great to us, he's built us a huge synagogue, which, by the way, we found, pretty cool if you want to research that. He's built us this huge synagogue. Jesus, will you come and do us this favor by healing his servant? Now, this is pretty impressive because I read a story about Pontius Pilate. Remember the guy who killed Jesus? Pontius Pilate one time was building these aqueducts in Jerusalem. And so he takes the temple money from the Jews. He just raised their temple, takes their money, and he wants to build these aqueducts. And the Jews got kind of mad at this, right? Like, would you like it if the government came in here and took the church funds in order to build like a road? You'd be kind of mad. And so the Jews started this huge riot, so bad that here's what Pilate did. He made Roman soldiers undercover, dressed them up like Jews, and sent them out with clubs. And he says, at the sound of the signal, I want you to just go to town. And so he gives a signal, and all of a sudden these Jews are rioting, and then the guy beside him rioting pulls out a club, throws his tunic off. Oh my goodness, it's a Roman, and he starts beating them. They just started beating the Jews. Not to kill them, they did kill some, but just to disband the riot. And they did. The riot was completely disbanded. Now I say that to say, think about the contrast with the centurion. Here's a man who's over this area, and he doesn't have that sort of relationship with the Jews. He's got a great relationship with the Jews. One where he doesn't cheat them. He's not a swindler. In fact, he uses money to build them something that's good for them. How cool would it be if the government said, hey, we're going to come, build you a new church building? Sweet. Right? I mean, that would make us go, I like that. And so this is the sort of man that we're talking about. One that respects human life. One who has a slave but treats him like a son. A man in authority. A man of great faith. Look at this. Verse 8, when the centurion finally comes, he says this, Lord, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I'm also a man under authority with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and he does it. So the centurion says to Jesus, look, all right, I've sent to you people, and I've had second thoughts. I don't need you to make your way all the way to my house. I don't need you to go against the culture and come into a Gentile's house. I don't need that. I know that you're a man of authority. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. You see, this guy knows it's a matter of authority with Jesus. He has it. It's just, will you use it? And look how Jesus responds. When Jesus heard this, he marveled. He was astonished. This guy shocked Jesus. How cool is that? He shocks him and Jesus said to those who were following, "Truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. I say to you, many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness, in the place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Jesus says this: there are going to be people, Gentiles like this man, from all over the earth who will come into the kingdom, and the Jews who were supposed to have the kingdom will be cast out because they reject me. Why? Because this man accepts my authority to such a great degree that he has shocked me. That a man, a Gentile at that, would believe I had that sort of authority to just speak the word. An unprecedented miracle. It reminds me of, and I read the article, and I was going to go over it with you, but for the sake of time, I'm not. Watch the movie. I heard there's a movie on it. The miners in Chile who were trapped. You guys remember that? 69 days trapped, like 2,500 feet under the earth. I would have died out of mere just panic, because that would freak me out. But the story of these guys, the fact, it literally is, if you think about a divine miracle, the fact that they were trapped under there, they pretty much had nothing to eat, nothing to drink, and it took about 17 days for the people even to drill all the way to them to start dropping supplies, and all the stuff that they went through. And you watch the movie, I don't know, I haven't watched it, or read something about it online. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's an unprecedented thing. That's why there's a movie about it, because never before has anybody been trapped under the earth for that long and stayed alive, much less 33 of them. So my question is, can we trust Jesus through a situation we've never been through before? When churches begin to evangelize and begin to reach out to the community, something's going to happen. You know what it is? It's called change. You know why it's going to change? Because there's going to be new people. And you're going to have to learn how to adapt. We've always done church like this. Cool. But now you got 10 new people that had never done church like that before. And they have different needs and different issues. And we have to introduce them to Jesus. And the church may start off in a house with a bunch of young people. Great. But what happens when they start evangelizing, or maybe they get older and they start having kids? Now what? Now you need a nursery. You see what I'm saying? Things change. So as things change, and as we here at Liberty begin to, follow after God and want to do His will, the question is, do we trust His authority through situations we've never been through before? But through prayer, this man was healed. And without his faithful friend, he would have never been healed. So think about this morning, who may be out there that we need to be thinking about like that? We're their faithful friend. And we're going to Jesus asking Him, will you heal this person? Because they won't be healed unless somebody intercedes for them. Last story. Verse 14. When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, the fever left her, she got up and waited on him. And when evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. I like how Peter's mother-in-law, when she's healed, she immediately jumps up and begins to serve. She doesn't waste time, does she? It reminds me of this story. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but I'll read part of it. It was a Sunday morning, 18th century London. Robert Robinson's mood was anything but sunny. All along the street, there were people hurrying to church. In the midst of the crowd, he was a lonely man. The sound of church bells reminded him of years past when his faith in God was strong and the church was an integral part of his life. It's been years since he set foot in a church. He's been wandering, disillusioned, gradual defection from God he once loved. And that love for God, once fiery and passionate, has slowly burned out with him, leaving him dark and cold inside. He begins to hear a carriage come up beside him. And he goes to wave it down so he can get a ride. And he realizes it's taken, so he says, no, go ahead on. The lady inside says, no, that's fine, come on in. You can ride with me. So he gets into the carriage. And she says, are you going to church too? And he kind of hesitates for a moment. And he says, yeah, I think I am. And so she says, well, what is your name? And he says, my name is Robert Robinson. And she goes, well, that's an interesting coincidence. She took out a book from her bag, and she says, I was just reading a small inspirational book, and I just read a verse from a poet named Robert Robertson. And he goes, yep, that was me. And he took the book, and he said, yeah, I wrote these words years ago. And she said, oh, how wonderful. Imagine sharing the same carriage with this poet that I love so much. And he read the words, and I'm going to close with this. All right, this is going to be my closing. If you guys with the band want to come on up. But the words were this. As he read the words, he thought about how his wandering life, how he's gone away from God, gone away from church, gone away from serving, and that fiery passion has died out. He read these words that he wrote years before. Hear me. Come, thou fount of every blessing. Tune my heart to sing thy grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing. Call for songs of loudest praise. And his eyes slipped down to the bottom of the page where he read this. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, oh take and seal it. Seal it for thy course above. And he read those lines and tears began to run down his face. And the woman said, you may have wrote those words years ago, but it's not too late for you. Those words can speak to you as well. And he went back to church that day. You see, some of us have been healed, but we're still lying in bed. My call to you this morning, God's call to you this morning is, get up and serve and recognize the King's authority. Will you guys stand as we sing our song of invitation? If anybody has a decision they need to make for Jesus this morning, will you come up front?